Okay, so for this set of lecture slides, we're going to be talking about transmission of parasites. So how do the parasites actually transmit disease? So for transmission of parasites, they can happen in several different ways. There can be transmitted through animals. These are sometimes known as zoonotic diseases. We can also have blood transmission, transmission through food, transmission with vectors like insects, and transmission in water that's contaminated. So when we look at zoonotic diseases, these are diseases that normally occur in non-human animals, but then they can be transmitted, they cross over and get transmitted into humans. So there's a number of different types of microbes that can cause zoonotic diseases. So viruses and bacteria also do too, but there's also organisms that are considered parasites that can lead to zoonotic diseases, like ringworm. Toxo would be considered protozoan that is a zoonotic. Okay. So in many cases, this is because with the life cycle, there's multiple hosts that are going to be involved within the life cycle. And one of the hosts would be, again, a non-human. But because maybe humans are having close interaction with these other types of animals, they could become exposed. So when we look at all zoonotic diseases, again, including viruses and bacteria and parasites, there's at least 150 worldwide. And we're actually seeing an increase in the number of zoonotic diseases. And, if we think about how we lived previously versus how we live nowadays, the human population is moving away from the city and moving in, more suburban or rural areas. And so whenever we're living in rural areas, we're more likely to come in contact with wildlife. We also have more recreational time than we used to. And so people go to nature preserves to go for a walk, and you may come across scat or poop from wildlife. And so in that case, you might become accidentally exposed to the parasites, eggs that are being shed in that scat, in that poop. So this table looks at some of the different common zoonotic infections. So definitely on the virus bacteria side, you've probably heard of these. So like if we look at viruses, things like rabies, West Nile virus, we'll start to hear about over the summertime as we have more mosquitoes, because they act as a reservoir when we get bitten by mosquitoes. If they have West Nile during that blood meal they take, they can transmit West Nile virus to us. For bacteria, Rocky Mountain spotted fever would be an example, leptospirilla. So some of these are, found in domesticated animals, and so we have vaccines against them. So it's really important it's why it's important that you vaccinate your pets, because by preventing the disease in them, you also prevent the disease being spread to you. Okay. If in that miscellaneous category is where we see our parasites, what would be covered in our class. And again, so things like ringworm, tapeworm, toxo would all be examples. And again, we can see that the animal reservoir or host species which we contracted from varies. So anything from pigs to dogs, cats, and also wildlife like raccoons and coyotes and such. For bloodborne parasites, these are ones that can be found in the bloodstream of infected people. So they can get transmitted through insect bite. So if a parasite feeds on someone who's been infected, when they take a next meal, that can be transmitted. It can also get transmitted through blood transfusions or sharing of needles. So whenever there's any kind of transferring of blood, that becomes a risk of transmission. So if we think of like malaria, transmission to that would be bloodborne. And so again, when a mosquito bites an infected individual, they're going to pick up some of those parasites when they feed on the next individual. In the process of like when an insect bites, they regurgitate first, and when they regurgitate, they can regurgitate the parasites. They also produce different factors that stop clotting, and they also produce factors that actually numb you, so that you don't feel the bite as much also. So with blood transfusions, potential donors are going to be screened, and they're screened for a number of different potential health factors, but some of them have to do with potential where blood transfusions could lead to the spreading of parasites. And so you'd be asked whether you've been exposed or had babiosis or Chagas disease. And so if you answer yes to either, you wouldn't be allowed to donate. Okay, they also ask you about your recent travel. And so obviously if you're traveling in areas where malaria is common, they're not going to want you to donate. So you would have to, usually there's like a 1-year waiting period that you can't donate. If you've actually been diagnosed with malaria, then it's a 3-year waiting period. And obviously, if you're interested in donating blood, then you always do check whatever the current guidelines are, because different organizations will have different recommendations as far as who can donate or not. Okay. And there's a number of, when you donate your blood, there's a number of tests that are done to the blood for infectious agents. So even if you said you're fine, they still screen it just in case, and then you would be notified. Just as a disclaimer, you should not donate blood in order to get tested. You should only donate blood if you think you are healthy enough to donate. So when we look at transmission of parasites through food, there's a number of different protozoans and hemolymphs that can be transmitted through food, such as Cryptosporidium, Giardia, Psychospora, Toxoplasma, and a number of roundworms and tapeworms. So it's not just one type of parasite that gets transmitted by food. So all of these would have like an egg or a cyst phase, and so those are very resistant. So that especially if we're eating food that isn't cooked, there's more of that potential. But in many cases, if you cook the food, these are not as resilient as like endospores that you see in bacteria. So these cysts and eggs could be damaged enough that you wouldn't be able to get sick from them. Okay. Many of the organisms will cause an issue in the food because they're actually transmitted through the water or soil or person-to-person contact, and then the food gets contaminated in that process. So, if we're using water that's been contaminated to fertilize crops, then that's going to increase the likelihood that the food's going to become contaminated and then could transmit. If it's grown in contaminated soil, or it's being handled with people who are sick and shedding the parasites, the eggs, the cysts, then it's going to be more likely that the food is contaminated. So things like undercooked fish, crabs, mollusks, because they could be in contaminated waters, undercooked meat, or if you have like aquatic plants such as like watercress, it might be added into a salad or as garnish. Those can get contaminated. Same thing with raw vegetables. Sometimes those get contaminated with human or animal fecal material. So sometimes the human. So whenever we've had like the romaine lettuce recall, like the inspectors will go on site and they'll realize that some of the workers might have been using the field as a bathroom. But at the same time, one of the techniques to fertilize crops is by taking animal waste from a farm, making it into a liquid form, and then spraying the fields with that as a fertilizer. So obviously, again, if the animals are ill or the workers are ill, that's going to get onto the food. And again, it's especially of concern if the food is not being cooked properly or does not get cooked. So again, like the raw vegetables or plants. So it's really important to make sure that food safety service workers are practicing good hygiene and that the facilities are working on are sanitary. So if you have poor hygiene practices, so you're not washing your hands after going to the bathroom and then you're going into the food prep area, that would be unsanitary. Also, if you like any of the, the places in which are providing the food for restaurants, those also need to be sanitary. So, most places are being inspected, but if you're only being inspected twice a year, sometimes shortcuts are being made when inspections aren't going on, and obviously that can cause issues. When we look at insects, they can act as a biotic reservoir, so a living reservoir, and so they can act as a vector in the transmission. And so sometimes these are referred to as vector-borne diseases. So insects can act both as a biological vector, like a biotic vector, or they can act as mechanical vectors. So in some cases, the insect is just transmitting it from one location to another location. So example here is like if we have a house fly and the house fly is inside the house where people are sick, or maybe it's an outhouse, and they come in contact with the fecal material, they're going to carry some of that fecal material on the exterior, on their legs, because they have these little hairs on it. So when they move to the next location, they would be depositing some of that material, including if there was cysts or eggs in there. And so if they're laying, I always pick the potato salad. On the potato salad at a picnic, now they've deposited those potentially infectious agents onto it. With a biological vector or an obligatory host, this is where they're part of the life cycle, right? So this is where mosquitoes tend to be biological vectors. And so with malaria, the transmission is through mosquitoes. If we didn't have mosquitoes, then we don't get bitten by the mosquitoes, then we wouldn't get the transmission of the parasites. There's a number of examples of different viral illnesses, bacterial illnesses, protozoan illnesses that are transmitted through these biological vectors. So this figure just kind of streamlines some of that into a nice visual of we've got biological vectors such as mosquito, and so for this vector, they're actually infected. The pathogen, the parasite, is inside of them, and again, it's usually part of their life cycle. So it's not that they become infected and die because of it. They can be a natural host, a reservoir for them. With a mechanical vector, like the housefly, it's just a passive carrier. The pathogen's external, so they're never infected with it. Okay. So here we can see how in panel A we have this mechanical vector, the fly, and it's going to, pick up pathogens, these cysts or eggs from fecal material, and as it flies over, because it's got all these little hairs on its leg, when it lands on the food, it could transfer those pathogens onto the food, and so, we're not cooking the food again. So when we eat that, we would ingest any of those pathogens, again, for our purposes, those cysts or eggs. Now, when we look at panel B, we're looking at a biological vector, and so again, this is where this person has been bitten by the mosquito bite because this mosquito is infected with the parasite, and so now it's able to spread through. Now, when they get bit again by maybe a different mosquito, it now is going to take up that parasite, and it could potentially transmit it to another person. Okay. Now, when we look at abiotic reservoirs, water would be an example. So it's a non-living reservoir. And so parasites can live in water sources. And so, if you've read about the brain-eating amoeba, that would be one that lives in the sediment of freshwater bodies, so like lakes. They don't tend to live very well in streams because streams are moving, so they like still areas. But when people go and jump into the water, it disperses them. Okay, so water is very important for these organisms, and then we tend to also interact with water because it's very important for us. And so because of those interactions, we could become exposed to parasites. Also, if we think there's a lot of other organisms that are using water sources, so you've got waterfowl, ducks and geese, and they're pooping in the water. So if they have some kind of infection, when they defecate into the water, and then we were going to go swimming in the water, we could then end up sick with that. Okay. So there are different types of transmission for communicable infectious diseases. And so we can have direct transmission or indirect. And so on the left side, we have our direct transmission. And so this is where there's going to have to be close contact in order for transmission to happen. And so we could have direct contact, so like things like kissing or having sex. If our partner has an infectious disease, that could get then transmitted to us. Droplets, so when we're talking, if we're in close proximity to each other, those droplets could get dispersed. So no matter how quiet you're talking, there's a certain amount of droplets, very small droplets, that are leaving your mouth as you're talking. And we all know with coronavirus that we should maintain 6 feet away, and that's because we don't want to end up picking up those droplets. Also with direct, we can have vertical transmission, and so this is where the mother would be sick and have an infection and then transmit that to the fetus. And then we have our biological vectors. So we need direct contact. We need the mosquito actually biting, and that's how transmission could happen. For indirect transmission, this is where fomites, contact surfaces, might allow an infected person to deposit. So if we cough into our hands and then touch a door handle, we would end up depositing any of that. Or if we didn't wash our hands after we used the restroom and maybe we've got, some Giardia going on, we could be depositing that Giardia onto these contact surfaces or fomites. This can lead to fecal-oral contamination, right? So again, if we don't wash our hands after we use the bathroom, surfaces we're touching could be contaminated with fecal material, and in that fecal material could be infectious agents. Again, for our purposes, cysts or eggs. And so that then when someone else touches that, or if it's landing onto some kind of surface like a cooking pan, that could lead to transmission. And even the act of flushing your toilet causes this kind of backdraft, this some of that material gets into the air, and so surfaces near the toilet, if you're not putting your lid down, can get exposed indirectly to the pathogens. Okay, so with that, we can have contamination to the food, water, or other biological products where, because of the either indirect depositing of fecal material on those surfaces, they become contaminated. Also, more so with viruses and bacteria, they could become aerosolized, so they can be transmitted through the air, and that's through respiratory droplets. So again, when we're breathing, or if we cough, sneeze, those droplets can get expelled, and they could have pathogens on them. So one thing to keep in mind with these transmissions, some of these are more prone to happen with viruses or bacteria. So for our class, the focus is not viruses and bacteria because of microbiology, but you should know all these different types of transmission when it comes to the exam. So just be aware of that. So even if it isn't a mode of transmission for, like I haven't given an example of a parasite, protozoan or hemolymph, that's transmitted through that mode, it's still fair game when it comes to the exam. So with these modes of transmission, it's really important that we use universal blood and body fluid precautions. So you guys did the CTI training and you've learned about how to protect yourselves against pathogens, but maybe you're working in an environment in a hospital setting or a nursing home setting where you have patient contact and you would be taking a bloodborne pathogen training. And part of that is making sure that you're taking universal precautions, so guidelines that are set forth by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, so the CDC. And so we always want to make sure we assume that all patients could be harboring an infection. So when we're in contact with the patient, but also with any of the specimens from the patient, that we're making sure that we are protecting ourselves. And, think of the disease you don't want, and right now that's probably COVID, making sure that any of your patients that you're having contact with or their specimens, their samples, could be infected with that. And so you want to make sure that you're wearing gloves, face masks, eye shield, gowning up in order to make sure that you don't get infected with that disease. Okay. And so in the lab scenario, if we're working with potential pathogens, there's certain precautions we take. Again, like wearing gloves, making sure that we're not creating any kind of droplets that could accidentally breathed in. When we return to campus in the fall, for whatever classes do return face-to-face, there are going to be precautions that are going to be taking place, so that basically, there's a certain precautions that we take in our labs to begin with. That's obviously going to be heightened. And then even though some of those precautions are going to be taken even in a traditional lecture setting. Okay, so I think we've all really have a good understanding of PPEs, personal protective equipment, and what we can do to keep ourselves safe. And again, for right now, we're thinking about COVID, but in any given setting, if there's an outbreak of something, we could be thinking of how could we protect ourselves. So looking at transmission, epidemiologists play an important role in this. So epidemiology is the study of the frequency and distribution of disease and other health-related factors in defined human populations. And so the CDC is the head epidemiology bureau for the U.S., the World Health Organization is our global center kind of for epidemiology. And then within each state, there's your Department of Public Health, and then each county has their Department of Public Health. And in most places, at least in Massachusetts, each town has health inspectors, a health department, and so all these people are working together to make sure that we're trying to manage infectious diseases so that people are not becoming sick. But it's not just infectious diseases. Epidemiologists look at a lot of other factors, so things like smoking, Tide Pods were a big thing, right? So when people were ingesting Tide Pods, and not just like the teenage dare, but like young children, the CDC actually mandated that companies would have to put additional labels on. So epidemiology is not just microbiology, not just parasitology. It's looking at anatomy, physiology, immunology, medicine, but also sociology, ecology, and statistics. And there's a growing movement to look at environmental aspects and also veterinary aspects, and that's known as the One Health Initiative. So having human medicine working with veterinary medicine, working with the environmental sciences, so that we can really have a good picture of what's going on, because with epidemiology, you're always trying to ask the where, when, and how, and try to limit transmission from happening. So these are the resources that are used for this lecture, so I highly recommend going to them if you have further questions. So if you have any questions regarding this lecture, please do not hesitate to contact me so that we can address any of those questions. Thank you very much.